So for our scholars presentation topic, we are presenting on internally displaced persons due to climate change.
So one thing about internally displacement is climate migration, and this is causing due to rising temperatures in many locations because some places it's become hard to live in and even inhabitable. And this is due to like extreme weather conditions such as droughts, floods, heat waves, and rising sea levels. This has caused people to move because their homes, they can't live in their homes temporarily or even permanently. And climate migration has become an increasing trend due to rising temperatures constantly, since humans produce anthropogenic factors such as greenhouse gases due to fossil fuels and pollution. We're setting constant record temperatures annually, and this has caused many human populations to shift demographics.
So just to kind of go over a brief background about where this is happening, this is generally happening in nations that are most affected by climate change, mostly island states, states along oceans or waterways, states that undergo drought conditions, and states, a lot of third world countries are the ones that are most affected by this. In addition to that, the most vulnerable groups include children, persons with disabilities, and those disadvantaged groups are just at a greater disadvantage with climate change happening. And there's no one migration pattern from place to place. People mainly just move to the closest place that they can that is most habitable for them and that hasn't been as affected by climate change. As you can see from this little chart here, according to the IDMC, 5.9 million people have been internally displaced in 84 countries as of 2021. And these countries that are in darker blue are the ones that are most affected and that people are migrating to these places because it is just easiest and where is closest that they can find shelter. Because of climate change, a lot of conflicts have erupted from a lot of the climate migration. So first, there are a lot of debates over what a climate refugee is. The term doesn't even have an set international definition. So there's a lot of ambiguity with respect to who counts as a climate refugee and what rights they have. Generally, the general sense among the world is that a climate refugee is someone who is forced to migrate due to climate change disrupting their home. But the definition still causes confusion among many nations, and what rights to give those refugees is still unclear, as many nations aren't sure whether or not to give them citizenship or to give them housing. In addition, a lot of conflicts have erupted due to this, due to scarce resources that have become even more scarce because more people are going to places that are in need of those resources. So, for example, clean water is very high in demand and there's less to go around. There's definitely been shortages in food supplies, which has caused a lot of tension, which has led to prices soaring around the world, and it's made a lot of existing tensions among nations a lot worse because they just don't know how to deal with these climate refugees.
These are some of the financial and social impacts of displacement. On the left, you see here a picture of the Chad Basin in the 1960s compared to a picture taken of the Chad Basin recently in 2020. And its overall volume has decreased by 90%, whereas this has been contrasted with the population around the surrounding areas where it has skyrocketed recently. Due to this, a water shortage, a lot of insular groups and governments are capitalizing and monopolizing upon this resource in order to take control of the surrounding peoples. This is one of the social impacts that we're going to look at. Of the financial impacts, people often leave behind a majority of their assets or residences and belongings, which are then going to be taken, sold, and looted by bandits or people in the surrounding area who seek to use the crisis to their own gain, or they may just be completely destroyed in the ensuing chaos. The systems of work that many of these people have established break down, meaning that they can have no form of economic stability going into the camp or when leaving it, which can leave them stranded for many years. In regards to the social impact, due to desperation, people often have to scramble for resources in order to survive. And in doing so, in their desperation, they often have to work in jobs or in situations where they may be unsafe. They often have to make sacrifices to themselves or to their own families in order to survive. They may have to make deals in which are coercive towards them. So it can greatly impact the social security and the social stability of a culture. Some of the common issues that IDPs face are a lack of resources in displacement camps, which extends to not only needed resources such as that of food and water and shelter, but also resources that will eventually help stabilize these IDPs, which include education, employment opportunities, opportunities to get out of the country or the situation in which they are in if it's not feasible for them to return. There's a lack of resources on information on what they can do to survive outside of the camp. So all of this culminates to essentially people being forced to live inside the camps if they want to survive, but being unable to progress out of that because of a lack of resources. Additionally, there are heightened tensions between racial groups and religious groups due to the extreme stress that they are placed between. And because of this, religious leaders and ethnic leaders will be pitted against each other, and they will essentially be forced to work with their own groups to try to monopolize and to control as many resources as possible, usually to the detriment of the other people in the situation. Additionally, like I mentioned before, there is an extreme lack of employment for the people in the internally displaced camps, which means that they can't go out of their country, they can't leave their situation feasibly, they can't progress even within their own situation without money. They can't um, feasibly sustain themselves once the camps are either demolished or taken away somehow. And this leads to a situation where uh, outside groups have to divert so much resources into these camps that it eventually becomes impossible for these people to live without them because they aren't given the proper resources to do so. Additionally, across the world, IDPs share many similar circumstances, such as families having difficulties staying together during displacement crises, and this may include large-scale families such as cousins to aunts to uncles, but generally it also extends to even keeping parents and children together, which makes the entire situation much more stressful and much more bureaucratically complicated because since it's so chaotic, there's no real system set in place for who's going where that can be always verified, which means that it's very difficult to reunite people if they've been separated. Um, and beyond that, a lot of these people cannot leave these internally displacement groups, not only because they don't have the resources to do so, but because they are forcibly being kept there by external groups, such as in the picture I showed before of the Lake Chad Basin. One of the groups that monopolized upon that resource was Boko Haram, which essentially meant that a terrorist group held partial control of a necessary water resource in the region, which meant that other groups had to fall in line with their ideals and work with them if they wanted to survive. So they couldn't necessarily just leave that situation because if they did, they would obviously suffer and likely die.
As for legislation for or what is being done, it has been predicted there could be up to 1.2 billion climate refugees by 2050. To counteract this, currently most forced environmental migration situations are being mitigated by subglobal initiatives. Examples of these initiatives are the United Nations Human Rights Council planting trees as a preventive measure at their refugee camps to counteract landslides, water diplomacy, and water governance, and also the UN migration research and political calls to address climate displacement. It should also be noted there are critiques on current legislation because most of the issues are being mitigated on a sub-global level. There are gaps in global governance that prevent meaningful change, specifically differing processes and views on how to rehabilitate refugees. International law also currently does not protect or recognize climate refugees. Regarding what can be further done, a universal definition of what it means to be environmental refugee needs to be established. A foundation of human rights for the displaced needs to be created. Strengthening environmental emergency policies and legal protections for the displaced. Agreeable adaptive practices on a national level need to be created, and more research and advocacy for forced migration and rehabilitation.